Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War Warhammer 2 Quick Match gameplay. This time around we are going to be covering a pair of Empire vs. High Elf games, the first of which is on the Battle of the Cairns. So, I do believe that Empire against High Elves is one of the worst matchups for Empire. And that is because High Elves basically have a tool to counter some of the Empire's greatest strengths. Now granted, Empire is known for being a very flexible, very well-rounded faction, but nonetheless, Empire does definitely have it lacks heavily armored infantry with the exception of Greatswords. Its shooting is very susceptible to enemy fire, and its main striking power is often made up of cavalry, and the High Elves have a huge amount of fairly cheap anti-large, as well as some expensive elite anti-large in the form of Phoenix Guard. So I wanted to make a build with the Empire that could hopefully counteract High Elves in a very consistent manner and beat them in a straight up sort of fight without having to rely on any sort of luck or any sort of gimmick or anything like that. So for my Lord, I did take Volkmar, and this is definitely, I think, one of the only really questionable picks in this composition. The reason I took Volkmar is because Boris Todbringer, I didn't want to bring a Mounted Lord. Mounted Lords, because High Elves have a lot of flying monsters, they have a lot of shooting, they have net spells, all that sort of stuff. A Flying Lord is very, very, very susceptible to enemy archery fire or enemy monster goon squads of, say, Star Dragons or Princes on Star Dragons, that sort of stuff. Especially if it's Boris or the Empire General of the Empire or something like that. Volkmar, while perhaps not being quite as good in close quarters as Boris is, he does have regen thanks to the Jade Griffin. He does have Benediction, which provides an extra leadership bonus around him on top of the encouragement he provides. He is fairly tanky. Being on foot, he's of course fairly hard to kill off. He has Randhammer Sigmar, which is an AoE boost for 44 seconds, providing plus 26 melee attack, which will hopefully help me melt down any front lines. Grand Shield of Faith, 22% ward save, just really solid. And Grand Soulfire, which is an AoE bombardment, but also reduces enemy magic damage. And I do believe this could actually be useful if your opponent does decide to do some sort of magic cheese, essentially. Now, alongside him, I did bring an Empire Captain, simply to stiffen up my front line. The Empire Captain is, in my opinion, one of the better lords, or better heroes to take if you're playing as Empire, simply because he's fairly tanky. He's very, very cheap at only 500 gold. He can tank in your front line. He can dilute enemy attacks, and at the same time hit somewhat hard. Alongside him, I did bring a Grey Wizard. The Grey Wizard has been stripped down quite a bit. He's obviously a very flimsy close quarters combatant, but he does still provide encourage, and more importantly, he does have an enfeebling foe, as well as the Penumbral Pendulum. Penumbral Pendulum is really my main counter to kind of try to drop down the High Elves' HP pool to the point that they lose martial prowess. I also did give him the Power Stone, because that, of course, allows him to have a whole bunch of power reserves, hopefully. My front line is composed entirely of Greatswords. I have 5 units of them, and every single one is veteran up by a lot. Now, it does vary a little bit. The 2 out here on the flanks are only veteran up to veteran C8. The 3 on the left are all veteran up to veteran C rank 9. And you might be wondering why that is. Well, it's for 2 reasons. One, to improve their leadership. Greatswords with improved leadership are very, very hard to break with terror and fear and that sort of stuff, and demoralize with artillery, which of course High Elves can bring a lot of shooting, and to some extent they can also bring artillery. And it also means their melee stats are very, very solid, especially when considering the fact that they also have a bonus against infantry on top of that. They have a bonus against infantry of 8, they also, with a melee attack of 36, melee defense of 44, these guys will be able to outtrade basically any High Elf infantry, with the possible exceptions of Phoenix Guard and Swordmasters of Hoeth. But I'm hoping that with the help of the Grey Wizard debuffing those targets, these guys can still be able to trade effectively. Out on the flanks, I do have my own units of shooting. Silver Bullets on one end, Sterling's Revenge on the other. Of course, these guys have Stalk. Sterling's Revenge also does have immunity to psychology, but the key here is the fact that these guys have Stalk, and they have a lot of armor-piercing damage. These guys are there to break up enemy flying units, to shoot down really targets of opportunity. Finally, in the back, I do have a single unit of Demigryph Knights with Halberds, who are just there to shut down enemy cavalry, to shut down enemy dragon princes, enemy flyers, if they try to land on the ground, that sort of stuff. Now, my opponent did decide to bring a somewhat interesting, I think, High Elf build, and this was one of the matches I did want to demonstrate. He did go very monster heavy. He brought a Prince. The Prince, of course, on the Star Dragon, and the Star Dragon has absolutely monstrous melee stats: 64 melee attack, 58 melee defense, 580 weapon strength, 80 armor, decent charge bonus, though nothing impressive at 45. But more importantly, of course, breath attack, foe seeker, he does deadly onslaught, stand your ground, all that sort of stuff, causes fear and terror, absolute powerhouse, over 6,000 HP. Alongside him, he does have 2 Frostheart Phoenixes up in the air, and Frostheart Phoenixes, of course, also cause armor-piercing damage. They have a pretty cool debuff ability that affects everything around them. Not that one. This just provides them with ward save, but they do have this ability, Blizzard Aura, which reduces our nearby units' armor-piercing damage and melee attack by a significant amount, which could definitely be a bit of a problem for me. My opponent's front line is fairly flimsy with only a handful of spear units, but perhaps with the help of the Froststar Phoenixes, these guys can hold a decent amount of time, and they are backed by Lothran Seaguard with shields. Now, Lothran Seaguard with shields are very, very difficult for Empire to counter because they outrange your handguns and crossbows. They have shields, which will basically negate over half of your fire before armor is calculated and accuracy is calculated and all that sort of stuff, and they will just mow down your squishy shooting units. Finally, out of my flank, my opponent has gone rather heavy with the shooting, and he has brought 2 units of Illyrian Reaver Archers. Illyrian Reaver Archers are, of course, pretty powerful. They're actually decent in melee. They're not no pushovers as long as their martial prowess is up. As you can see, these guys do have 32 melee attack and 34 melee defense, despite being skirmish caps. So they can definitely perform the function of a kind of light cavalry if called for. You can see they're already exchanging fire with my silver bullets, and we are going to throw things into full speed just to kind of see how things go. Now, I do see these Illyrian Reavers pushing towards my silver bullets, and immediately I suspect that they are going to simply rush the silver bullets. And so what I'm doing is I'm counterattacking them with Demigryph Knights. The Demigryphs will, of course, absolutely stomp Illyrian Reaver Archers. That is absolutely no contest. And while silver bullets do not have the best of stats, with 27 melee defense, they will actually be able to hold out somewhat effectively against the Illyrian Reaver Archers, and the Demigryphs are completely going to rout them. Over here in the front line, unfortunately, Volkmar has not been quite able to stay to keep up. And as you can see, he's being surrounded by the Phoenixes, he's being attacked by the Dragon Prince, and he is going to have a very, very hard time. You can see the Sterling's Revenge is firing on my opponent, and now I'm dropping a Penumbral Pendulum, trying to whittle down this Lothran Seaguard, make him a little squishier, and hoping that my Greatswords can kind of just chop their way through these spears and get in. Now you can see I'm taking some arrow fire, but Greatswords, the reason I bring Greatswords primarily, besides their bonus against infantry, is also their heavy armor. At 95, they are very, very resistant to the pretty low-end armor-piercing values on Lothran Seaguard. We can actually check what it is while Volkmar is getting himself murdered, and it is only 4. Now over here, Volkmar is getting killed. He is very low on HP. He has been dropped to 537 HP. And over here you can see the Sterling's Revenge is getting attacked by the Froststar Phoenix, getting debuffed by that aura. And my silver bullets are still firing while my Demigryphs are trying to zone away. You can see I've actually stopped microing them for a second. But they have kind of tried to zone these guys away. You can see they're still fleeing. Volkmar is going to go down shortly. He simply doesn't have the tankiness. He's already actually reached his healing cap, and he's going to go down. He's just going to die very shortly. Unfortunately for my opponent, though, his front line is definitely buckling. The Greatswords are definitely doing a good job. You can see another Penumbral Pendulum is going to go down, and it is going to absolutely cleave through these Lothran Seaguard, dishing out a lot of hurt and definitely disrupting their formation a decent amount. These Greatswords are having a rough time, but everywhere else the Greatswords have completely won when the Lothran Seaguard is not able to contribute. And it's important to note that while the over-veteran Greatswords are very expensive, they're still actually cheaper than the Lothran Seaguard with shield and spear combo on a per-unit basis. This Empire Captain is also helping them plow through. Over here, while my poor Sterling's Revenge is definitely getting routed off, my Demigryphs are kind of helping zone away the Illyrian Reavers, who are wasting their ammo on them. At 125 armor, these guys are definitely not very susceptible to that archery fire, and I'm able to get my silver bullets into position and start shooting on the Prince. While these guys are definitely beat up HP-wise, these guys still actually are floating a decent amount of models. They have 59 models, which is definitely pretty solid. In the meantime, the Greatswords are getting into the chicken coop here, starting to chop up the Lothran Seaguard. You can see this last tiny unit of spears is getting diced up. My opponent does decide to dive in with his Dragon Prince and with his Prince and his Froststar Phoenix and pop Stand Your Ground, but he is still taking a lot of fire, and I drop Enfeebling Foe on him immediately. And the reason I drop Enfeebling Foe is to make sure the Prince cannot dish out a lot of hurt, and that if the Greatswords surround him, they can beat him down. Over here, the Greatswords have meanwhile chopped through the Spearmen. Now, one of the problems with Greatswords is they're very slow at 27 speed. They've actually been nerfed, but they will now be able to kind of swing around, go after the Lothran Seaguard, surround this Prince, and apply pressure that way. You can see this Lothran Seaguard, despite being beaten on by multiple units of Greatswords, is kind of still firing occasionally. But I'm definitely trying to kind of put down this Dragon Prince, and you can see the Greatswords, despite being beaten up very badly, are actually still holding and losing their Lord, are actually still sitting at over 40 leadership. You can see the balance of power is very, very even, but the Demigryph Knights over here are zoning away this Froststar Phoenix, and the good old Silver Bullets, despite have only lost 4 models, and they will be able to regroup and open fire once more. In the meantime, Empire Captain and Greatswords, 2 very, very healthy units of Greatswords at that, we're going to be able to sweep by and chase off the Lothran Seaguard. The handguns are unleashing their fire, and my opponent does decide to shoot at the Grey Wizard, which I think is a little bit of a mistake, because the Grey Wizard is fairly low at this point on Winds of Magic. And he can still, of course, cast Enfeebling Foe if push comes to shove. Now, unfortunately, he does not have the best of morale, but he's actually going to get terrified here, and he's going to break, which is definitely a little rough for him. But my Demigryphs are on the way, and that is going to force these flyers to get off the ground and kind of try to flee. You can see the Sterling's Revenge have returned, and the Silver Bullets are opening fire, just unleashing their fury on this poor Froststar Phoenix, who has dropped to 1,000 HP. The poor Dragon Prince has been caught on the ground, and you can see he's losing HP at an incredibly rapid rate, because Demigryph Knights with Halberds are, of course, still one of the most powerful anti-large units in the game, especially on the charge. Over here, you can also see the Silver Bullet still firing. Unfortunately, the Sterling's Revenge is going to get routed off, and I do believe this is for good. But in the meantime, on the ground, the Greatswords are surrounding the Froststar Phoenix, slowly but surely beating it down with overwhelming numbers. And my opponent's infantry, while it is rallying a little bit, is not really going to be able to save the situation here. Now this prince is going to be able to actually get out because my opponent does sacrifice his Illyrian Reavers to buy him some time to escape. But that is going to be, of course, a bad move for the Illyrian Reavers, who are going to get annihilated in a duel with the Demigryphs. The Demigryphs have still actually not lost a model, and they've actually gained 2 chevrons, which really shows how much damage they've been doing. Great swords are collapsing on the Illyrian Reavers, and unfortunately, my Silver Bullets are being routed off by these Illyrian Reavers, which is definitely a bit of a problem for me. However, my opponent's Dragon Prince is now down to 1200 HP. His Phoenix is very, very low on HP at 578, though it is chasing out the Sterling's Revenge. And these Illyrian Reavers are basically slaughtered to a man. They're down to 3 models. They're going to get run down a little bit here by the very angry Demigryphs, and they are simply going to shatter at this point. I do believe they might actually get slaughtered to a man. Poor Illyrian Reavers definitely not having the best times of it. Over here, though, my opponent is chasing down my poor Grey Wizard, down to 9 HP, and he's, I do believe, a goner. Actually, he does survive. It looks like the Dragon Prince is not quite able to finish him off, and shortly I'm going to be able to start bringing my Demigryphs back. Now, I don't want this pocket breaking, but I still do have my Empire Captain, who is pretty healthy, and definitely womping on this Froststar Phoenix, beating it down slowly but surely. You can actually see my opponent does launch another bit of breath against the Empire Captain, but it is going to do some damage to this Froststar Phoenix, and now he is committing his Phoenixes into the fray without first committing his infantry. In my opinion, if you want to kind of break this sort of pocket, or have a shot at breaking him, you definitely need to commit your infantry to first time down, followed by a rear charge from the Phoenixes. Unfortunately, my opponent does not do that, and despite routing the Empire Captain, my army is still able to stick around and run his troops into the dust, causing a shatter. So we're going to do I'm going to demonstrate one more match with this sort of composition, because I do believe this is a fairly worthwhile and solid composition against High Elves, and I definitely want to demonstrate it and kind of show how it works against various High Elf compositions. As you can see, the losses were not too tragic. I definitely lost Volkmar to some bad play. Had I been better on my micro, I would have simply kept him with the Greatswords. Definitely a bit of a mistake on my part, because I got very little out of Volkmar. Perhaps I would have been better off bringing Boris Todbringer because of his AoE debuffs in that sort of goon situation. I'm still on the fence about that, because Boris, with his changes, with Crush the Weak and with White Cloak of Ulrich, as well as, of course, Midland Runefang providing him a regen, is actually a pretty solid support lord at this point, arguably better than Karl Franz, and so I definitely think he's not a bad choice. But I did want to try out Volkmar in this sort of build, and I actually will be doing the same in the next build. Now, the Grey Wizard, I think, performed fairly well. It's a little hard to judge. 30 kills is actually not pushover level. He definitely helped with his Penumbral Pendulum. He did a little bit of melee. The Empire Captain did not rack up too many kills, but he definitely helped anchor the line and keep those Greatswords going. And the Greatswords absolutely minced through those spearmen and then tore through my opponents in Lothar and Seaguard. The handguns, or the Sterling's Revenge and the Silver Bullets, did a decent job of zoning away the Froststar Phoenix and the Prince, and also just drawing the attention of all these very, very expensive units and getting them into very bad situations against Demigryph Knights with Halberds. Obviously, these are not the Regiment of Renown Royal Altdorf Griffites, but they still do cause fear. They're still immune to fear because of that, and they're not likely to rout to terror. And definitely one of the biggest advantages of this build is that while I don't have flagellants, thanks to the very high morale on the super veteran Greatswords, backed by the encourage from various leaders, you can definitely stick around through fights for a very, very long time, and arguably outlast most, if not all, non-veteran High Elf units. So definitely, I think this is a pretty solid build, and we're going to hop into another game where I'm hoping to kind of demonstrate how this can work against a different sort of High Elf composition. So here we are on Bjornling's Gathering, once again running the exact same composition of Empire, but this time we are going up against a somewhat different High Elf build. Now, of course, you can see my deployment is basically the same. I do believe this is kind of an optimal deployment, where you put Volkmar in the center, you have your Grey Wizard on the sides, Empire Captain on the other flank, and they are just reinforcing the leadership of all these units, making sure that they are basically unbreakable, or very close to it. Behind them, of course, Demigryphs ready to flex, and on the flanks, the shooting units, because with their flat trajectory, you need as good of an arc as you possibly can. Now, my opponent, though, has decided to go with a bit of an alternative build here, and this is really why I wanted to demonstrate, showcase this match. I did run several matchups with this composition, but I really did think that these two matches were the ones that kind of showed how well this composition could work, and how it can perform against different factions. Over here, we are going up against Teclis, who is bit of an interesting pick, I suppose, but he has definitely some very, very potent spells for the High Elves. He, of course, does have the Potion of Troy, allowing him to replenish his health and give him massive damage resistance, kind of compensating for the fact that his stats are otherwise garbage, and as far as combat goes. He did bring Regrowth, he brought Flock of Doom, and he brought Net of Mintok, all of which are very, very powerful spells when dealing with Empire. Regrowth, of course, that physical resist can make your units very, very tanky. Flock of Doom just melts squishy, cheap infantry, which is kind of what makes up the majority of Empire. And Net of Mintok, of course, can immobilize high-end cavalry, can immobilize flying lords, that sort of stuff, and make them incredibly vulnerable to your cavalry, to your shooting, to that sort of stuff. So definitely a very potent kind of build here with Techless, and of course he did bring some of the side abilities, such as Shield of Safari and Wild Heart for those extra power reserves, and that bit of a ward save. Now my opponent's front line this time is definitely going for a lot more quality. He has brought multiple units of White Lions of Krace, but it is important to know that while their stats might appear very, very similar to the Greatswords, these guys are actually not quite on par. They have been veteran up a decent amount, and they do, of course, have martial prowess in effect right now, and that actually makes their melee attack somewhat higher than the Greatswords in raw numbers, but it's important to remember that the Greatswords do have the advantage of that bonus against infantry, which also affects their melee attack, as well as making their weapon strength a little bit better. The Greatswords also do have slightly better armor, and they do have more models. They have 90 models to the White Lions of Krace 75s. So when you compare these units, when you compare the 5 units of Greatswords to the 6 units of White Lions of Krace, given that these units are probably about the same, we've probably invested about the same into our front lines, me and my opponent, the Greatswords should most likely be able to win. They have the exact same model count as all of those units, and they do have a slight qualitative edge. Out on the flanks, I do have Sterling's Revenge on one end, of course, and Sterling Bullets ready to kind of push some fire into these guys. And the White Lions, while they do have a 30% ward save, will still struggle against that. But I do think White Lions are definitely not a bad pick against Empire, and definitely I think it's something you will see fairly often. Beyond that, my opponent has brought 3 units of Lothran Seaguard with shields. Of course, you don't have to bring too much shooting against Empire, because Lothran Seaguard can just dominate Empire shooting so decisively. These guys also, of course, have a bonus against large, so while my Demigryphs are pretty powerful against them, thanks to their high armor, they will still be able to definitely hit above their weight class. On the flank, my opponent does have a single unit of Spearmen, just kind of sitting in reserve, and a unit of Dragon Princes on the other end, ready to flex and try to shut me down if I attempt to flank with, say, Demigryphs. Finally, in the back, 2 units of Illyrian Reaver Archers, who can, of course, poke at me because they outrange both my Sterling's Revenge as well as the Silver Bullets. And, of course, I have no unit that's actually capable of catching them, and it's just a problem. So the moment the match starts, I'm immediately playing a bit aggressively, and unfortunately for me, Sterling's Revenge immediately gets spotted and is going to take some nasty fire from the Illyrian Reaver Archers. They immediately lose 4 models. Sterling's Revenge does not have the best HP pool on a per model basis. You can see they have a little over 5,000 HP for the whole unit, while Greatswords have nearly 7,000 with the same model count. I am pushing my Demigryphs forward a little bit, thinking about posturing and getting a bit of a charge into my opponent. But I decide against it, and I do pull the Demigryph Knights back. My opponent is definitely pushing Techless forward, just trying to get a bit of a convenient sort of engage, perhaps. Unfortunately, I do overextend a little bit with my Silver Bullets, and I'm now pulling them back. They're a little quicker than the Greatsword, so it's sometimes a little difficult to coordinate when you're keeping everything together. Now, I am committing my Grey Wizard and the Captain and Volkmar all into the fray, and you might be wondering why that is. It's to just simply to soak up the charge bonus on the White Lions. White Lions have a very good charge bonus of 22. It's actually better than the Greatswords. And so if I can soak that up, my Greatswords will get their full charge bonus, my opponent will not. And as you can see, the Greatswords, where they got their charge bonus, are absolutely mincing through these White Lions. Over here, my opponent has netted my Demigryph Knights and is now charging into my Sterling's Revenge. In the meantime, I have gotten a decent Penumbral Pendulum on this Lothran Seaguard, dishing out a little bit of hurt and putting some damage into him. In the meantime, this vanilla net of a Mintok, it is not overcast, is tying down my Demigryph Knights, and my opponent is now pushing forward with some Dragon Princes. I am trying to push my Silver Bullets into position to engage, but these guys are very, very beat up. I do cast an Enfeebling Foe on the Dragon Princes, which means that right as this engagement goes down, in spite of their monstrous charge bonus, they are going to get caught by some very angry Demigryphs, and they are in for a very, very rough time. As the engagement gets prolonged, these guys are in for an absolutely terrible bit of engagement. Unfortunately, my opponent does get an overcast Flock of Doom, and that is absolutely melting my shooting units. Unfortunately for my opponent, his Dragon Princes are getting melted in the process as well, because of course Demigryph Knights are just better than Dragon Princes, and they're better than Illyrian Reaver Archers, who are now pushing in to give the Dragon Princes a chance to disengage. In the meantime, my opponent's front line is completely caved, because the Greatswords, of course, are qualitatively much superior to the White Lions, as we discussed. Over here on the right-hand flank, despite being besieged by 3 units of White Lions, as well as Spearmen, the Greatswords are holding, though certainly not winning. We do nearly drop Techless, but he does pop his Potion of Troy, and decides to flee and escape Volkmar. In the meantime, Volkmar can commit himself against the Dragon Princes. The Dragon Princes are, of course, rather powerful, but they have now lost. They have now lost their HP pool has dropped below 50%, and so they have lost Martial Mastery. And when I drop Enfeebling Foe on them, they become so weak and so susceptible to damage that the Greatswords are actually able to dice through them very effectively. So you can see their melee defense is down to 3. And the Greatswords are still around and kicking, still doing a decent job. Over here, the Demigryphs are just raking in the kills, massacring these Illyrian Reavers who thought they could get away with it. And now most of my opponent's high-end troops have lost their martial prowess or martial mastery. Over here, the Greatswords are still trying to do their best. You can see I've shifted my Empire Captain over here, just trying to give these guys an opportunity. You can see that simply because their leadership is so high, these guys are sticking around to the very bitter end. I'm dropping a Grand Soulfire, trying to get a decent bombardment off, and my Demigryph Knights are plowing in, trying to get a charge in these white lines, hopefully break them. That high morale from being so highly veteraned is definitely making these guys a pretty solid choice. Definitely making them perform rather well at just holding the line when needed. Over here on the flank, once again my opponent is engaging, and once again I'm dropping an Enfeebling Foe on his Dragon Princes. And this is definitely proving to be something of a disastrous situation for my opponent, who is simply not able to get much value out of his Dragon Princes. Enfeebling Foe is a very powerful spell, and this debuff is making these Dragon Princes basically pitiful. And there you can see they're getting diced up by Greatswords. Illyrian Reavers are once again pushing in to save their Dragon Prince friends, but Illyrian Reavers against Greatswords, especially without their martial mastery, are in a terrible position. Unfortunately for me, my Demigryph Knights are getting a bit beat up, and I'm wasting, I would say, in some ways, my Greatswords on these engagements out on the flanks. I've also finally started getting my Silver Bullets back into position to shoot up the Spears and Teclis. My infantry is definitely not in an ideal state of HP, but I am constantly able to cast Enfeebling Foe. I'm able to get constant value out of my Greatswords, and they are slowly but surely dicing through my opponent's troops. Unfortunately, my Demigryphs have finally gotten shut down by a mixture of fire from the Lothern Sea Guard, fighting with the white lines of Krace, and some Teclis, I do believe, damage from the Flock of Doom, of course. Now, the Dragon Princes are finally kind of breaking apart. They're down to 5 models, less than 200 HP, and my opponent's army over on the left flank is completely breaking. My opponent is now trying to shut down the Silver Bullets with the Lothern Sea Guard. Definitely not a bad idea, because these guys are, of course, very squishy, very susceptible to that sort of stuff. But Volkmar is still around and kicking, and Volkmar is basically at full HP. He's dropping a Grand Shield of Faith, and I still have some pretty powerful units. I still have my Empire Captain in here. I still have these fairly healthy units of Greatswords. And if push comes to shove, I still do have a Grey Wizard. I still have some Greatswords over here. 44 models, 34 over there, another 15 over there. So slowly but surely I can kind of pull troops back in. These Demigryph Knights are very, very badly beat up at 4 models, Sterling's Revenge 20, and they're all routing, and they're most likely not coming back. However, my opponent is definitely down to his last legs. Poor Teclis over here is popping another Potion of Troy, just trying to stick around. But at this point, my opponent has decided that it is an unwinnable situation and does decide to exit the game. So it's definitely a very tight fight, the Pyrrhic victory, and it was very clear in the end game. However, as you can see, the Greatswords once again won out that frontline engagement. The Volkmar and his gang of heroes definitely helped support in the front line very, very effectively. The Empire Captain raked in 36 kills this time around. I definitely made a little bit less use of the Grey Wizard. I think one of the good ideas perhaps would be to drop Volkmar in favor of Boris Todbringer and giving the Grey Wizard Pit of Shades, because that would help make him more flexible with the kind of damage he can dish out. Demigryph Knights performed an absolutely stellar job. I definitely think my micro and usage of the Sterling's Revenge and Silver Bullets left a lot to be desired, and this was probably my weakest point in this entire game. As you can see, though, Greatswords performed very well. For my opponent, as you can see, none of the white lions performed in a comparable manner to the Greatswords. My worst unit of Greatswords performed roughly on par with his best unit of white lions. The Lothern Sea Guard definitely raked in a lot of kills, but most of those were, of course, against the squishy shooting, and similar situation for the Illyrian Reavers. Dragon Prince's 60 kills, definitely a respectable amount, but nonetheless not quite enough, and they were definitely getting shut down very hard by the Grey Wizard's debuffs. I definitely think this is a very solid composition to field a lot of Greatswords with a little bit of shooting support, Demigryphs, some sort of Lord, maybe a Boris, maybe Volkmar, but a self-sustaining Lord, a Grey Wizard for the debuffs and for the raw damage, just for that flexibility of spells, and then an Empire Captain. I definitely think it's a solid Empire build to counteract what is otherwise a pretty rough matchup with the High Elves. Definitely good game to my opponents, Creed and Squirrel. They definitely thought they had pretty solid builds. It was definitely a pretty fun matchup, definitely great to try. Those were pretty close matches, and it was definitely gave me an opportunity to test this build out. I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below so you can keep up with additional content. If you have any comments, criticism, any questions about Total War, Warhammer 2, anything like that, be sure to post them down in the comment section below, and I will respond as soon as I can. As usual, guys, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Wyvern out.